Iron Ridge. Maggie Dawson's hands had cracked open and started bleeding again. The lye soap bit deep into every split knuckle as she hauled a blood-stained shirt back and forth across the washboard. The water sitting in the tin basin had already gone pink, but she kept right on scrubbing. If that stain was still there when she finished, Mr. Crowley would tell her she'd gone and ruined another one of his shirts. And once that happened, whatever punishment came down on her always hurt a whole lot worse than her raw hands did. The January wind sliced clean through the wooden lean-to behind Crowley's saloon, rattling the loose boards like a set of chattering teeth. Maggie didn't stop working. Boot steps crunched across the frozen dirt behind her. Her whole body went tense. She was expecting Mr. Crowley's heavy shadow to fall over her again, but the voice that reached her next was quiet, unfamiliar, and strangely soft. "Ma'am," the man said gently, "you're bleeding." The water in the basin had gone cold well over an hour ago, but Maggie Dawson kept right on scrubbing anyway. Her hands made slow, steady circles against the washboard, numb from the Wyoming winter that cut through the town of Red Hollow, like something sharp and merciless. The lean-to behind Crowley's saloon barely put up a fight against the wind. Dusty snow drifted in through the gaps in the boards, settling across Maggie's worn dress, and melting the moment it touched her skin. She barely paid it any mind. Her fingers had gone so numb she could hardly feel a thing anymore. Small mercy, that. Maggie. She flinched at the sound of his voice. Sharp, cutting, the kind that didn't ask twice. Heavy boots crossed the frozen mud behind her. A big shadow fell over the wash basin and swallowed up what little moonlight she had left to work by. "You gone deaf, girl?" Mr. Crowley snapped. "No, sir," Maggie said quickly, keeping her eyes fixed on the washboard. She had figured out a long time ago that looking him in the face never ended well. "Then you'd better answer when I call." He snatched the shirt straight out of her hands and held it up to the thin light leaking from the saloon window. "This ain't clean," he said flatly. "Still got blood in the weave." "I'm trying, sir." The slap came fast. Her head snapped to the side, and the taste of copper spread across her tongue. "Don't make excuses," Crowley growled. He threw the shirt back into the dirty water. "And don't go bleeding on my property. You ruined that shirt, and it comes straight out of your pay." Maggie didn't bother pointing out the truth. He hadn't paid her in 3 weeks. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Crowley turned and stomped back toward the warm glow of the saloon. Laughter and piano music spilled out into the night when the door swung open, then swallowed itself whole when it banged shut again. Maggie picked up the shirt and started scrubbing harder. She was 26 years old, and she had spent almost every single one of those years washing other people's messes. Blood, whiskey, mud, and sometimes worse things she made a point not to think about. Her mother always called it honest work. Said Maggie ought to be grateful anyone hired a girl with her kind of reputation. Reputation. That was the polite word people in Red Hollow used. What they actually meant was something closer to this. Your father drank himself to death in a ditch somewhere. You work behind a saloon, and everybody in town knows exactly what kind of woman that makes you. But Maggie wasn't that kind of woman. She washed sheets for the girls who worked upstairs, and she scrubbed blood out of cowboys' shirts after knife fights. That was all. The water in the basin had gone red again. She dumped it out into the mud and wrestled the frozen pump handle until fresh water finally poured out, so cold it made her back teeth ache. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "Ma'am, you're bleeding." Maggie looked up. A broad-shouldered stranger stood at the edge of the lantern light, the brim of his hat throwing a shadow over his eyes. And for the first time in years, someone was looking at her like she was worth looking at. She dropped her eyes again quickly. Strangers taking notice of her never came to anything good. In Red Hollow, the only men who paid attention to women like her had one of 2 reasons for it, and neither one ever ended well. "I'm fine," she muttered, turning back to the washboard. The stranger didn't move. "That doesn't look fine," he said. "Ain't your concern." Silence stretched out between them. Maggie waited for him to walk away the way the others always did. Once it was clear she wasn't interested in company, but the boots behind her stayed planted right where they were in the frozen dirt. "Name's Wyatt," the man finally said. "Wyatt Mercer." Maggie scrubbed harder. "Good for you. Working late. Working always." The shirt dragged across the washboard with a rough grating sound. "You need something, mister? Saw you out here from across the street. Thought maybe you could use some help." That drew a laugh out of Maggie. It came out short and bitter. "Help," she said. "From you? From anyone?" She glanced up before she could stop herself. The man had stepped closer, into the thin spill of light coming from the saloon window. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with dark hair and windburned skin and the solid build of someone who worked outside year-round. His coat was worn but well kept. His boots were dusty from the road, but it was his eyes that threw her off. They weren't the hungry kind she'd gotten so used to seeing. They were calm. "Don't need help," Maggie said quickly. "Just need to get this done before morning. How much is he paying you?" Her jaw tightened. "That's none of your business. How much?" Maggie gave up the fight and let out a slow breath. $3 a week, she said. "When he pays." Wyatt's expression shifted. "When he pays?" She shrugged. Sometimes he remembers. The man glanced toward the saloon, where laughter and music drifted out into the cold, then looked back at her hands. They had cracked open in 3 places now. "I'll pay you 6, he said. The washboard stopped moving. Maggie blinked up at him. "What?" $6 a week, Wyatt repeated, steady as ever. "Every Friday, without fail." Her heart gave a hard thump. $6 was more money than she'd seen in months. "For what?" she asked carefully. "Work at my place. Cabin needs tending. Laundry, cooking, general housekeeping." "Where?" "North of here. Iron Ridge Ranch." Maggie stared at him. The name meant something. Everybody in the territory knew Iron Ridge, one of the biggest spreads within 50 miles. "What's the catch?" she asked. "Catch? Men don't offer double wages without wanting something extra." For just a moment, Wyatt looked almost offended. "No catch," he said. "Just honest work." "You saying what I do now ain't honest?" "I'm saying Crowley's robbing you," Wyatt replied quietly. "And we both know it." He tipped his hat slightly. "You deserve better than this." Maggie almost laughed again. Deserve. That word didn't carry much weight in Red Hollow. She went back to scrubbing. "I don't know you," she said. "Fair enough." Wyatt took a step back. "My offer stands. Iron Ridge Ranch. Ask for Wyatt Mercer." He turned to leave. Maggie's heart started pounding. The water in the basin swirled red beneath her hands. Behind her was the saloon door, and before dawn Crowley would be back, maybe alone, maybe not. Her stomach turned over. "Wait." She stopped, swallowed. "You live there?" she asked. "I do. Alone? For now?" Maggie frowned. "What's that mean?" Wyatt turned back slowly. The wind lifted a strand of dark hair across his forehead. "It means," he said, steady as a fence post, "I'm looking for a wife." The words hung there in the frozen night air between them. Maggie stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're crazy." "Maybe. But I'm honest." She wiped her bleeding hands on her apron. "You don't know me. I know enough." His voice didn't waver. "I know you're out here at midnight, scrubbing blood out of shirts for a man who hasn't paid you." He nodded toward her hands. "And I know you haven't stopped working, even though you're bleeding." Maggie felt something tighten in her throat. "That tells me plenty," he said. She shook her head slowly. "I don't love you. Didn't expect you to. I don't even like you. Fair. And I sure as hell don't know you." Wyatt shrugged. "Most marriages out here start the same way." He met her eyes. "But I'd treat you with respect." Maggie's hands went still. Respect. No one had ever offered her that before, not once in her life. And suddenly the cold night felt like it was holding its breath, waiting on her. Maggie stared at him for a long moment. The wind shook the boards of the lean-to. Somewhere inside the saloon, The piano hit a sour note, stumbled, and then found its way back. "You're serious?" she said at last. Wyatt Mercer didn't so much as twitch a smile. She shook her head, still trying to make it add up. "Why me?" The question slipped out before she could pull it back. Wyatt studied her for a beat. When he answered, his voice had gone softer. "Because you need a way out." The words settled heavier than the cold air around them. "And I need a partner." Maggie swallowed. A partner. Someone to keep the cabin running while he handled the ranch work. He shrugged. "Seems like we could help each other." Maggie looked back down at the wash basin. The water was red. Her hands were shaking. "You know what people say about girls who work behind saloons?" she asked quietly. "I've heard. And that doesn't bother you?" "No." She searched his face, hunting for the trick. There was always a trick. "You're lying." "I'm not." "You don't know what kind of life I come from." Wyatt held her gaze steady. "I know you're still standing." Maggie blinked. "What?" "Most folks who get treated the way you have eventually break," he said evenly. "But you're still here. Still fighting." He nodded toward the washboard. "Still working." Her throat went tight. Nobody had ever said anything like that about her. Not once in 26 years. "I ain't pretty," she said bluntly. Wyatt raised one eyebrow. "Didn't say you were. I ain't educated either. Don't read much. Can't write. That can be fixed." She frowned. "What? I can teach you." "You can read?" "Yes, ma'am. Cowboys don't read. I'm not just a cowboy." The way he said it made her want to ask more, but Maggie shook the thought loose and pushed on. "I ain't refined," she continued. "Don't know how to play piano or make polite conversation like those society ladies." Wyatt leaned one shoulder against the post. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Keep a house clean?" "Yes." "Work hard without complaining?" Maggie gave a short laugh. "I've been doing it my whole life." Wyatt nodded once. "Then you're exactly what I'm looking for." The words hung between them. Maggie looked back toward the saloon. The door creaked open briefly, someone stepping out to spit, and warm light spilled across the frozen ground for a moment before the door slammed shut again. That building had been her whole world, and it had never once been kind to her. Her future stretched out plain as anything if she stayed. More nights like this one. More men like Crowley. More years scrubbing other people's filth until her body gave out and someone tossed her aside like garbage. Or she could take a chance on a stranger. A stranger with calm eyes and steady hands. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked quietly. Wyatt shrugged. "Take your time." Maggie shook her head. "I don't have time. If Crowley caught her even talking to another man about leaving, he'd throw her out that night. Or worse." Wyatt seemed to understand without being told. "Then come with me now." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Now? Why not?" He stepped closer, close enough that she caught the smell of leather and horses and clean winter air on his coat. "What's keeping you here?" Maggie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her mother certainly wasn't holding a place for her. Ruth Dawson barely spoke to her anymore, except to remind her what a burden she'd always been. The town despised her. Crowley used her up. There was nothing here worth saving. "I got nowhere else to go," Maggie whispered. Wyatt held out his hand. "You do now." She looked at it, rough, calloused, and honest. Hands that had never hit her, hands that had never grabbed at her, hands that weren't demanding a single thing, just offering. Maggie wiped her bloody fingers on her apron, took a slow breath. Then she put her hand in his. "All right," she said. And just like that, her life changed forever. Maggie didn't go back for her things. She didn't stop to pack a bag or say her goodbyes. There wasn't much worth packing anyway. A second dress with patches on both elbows, a thin shawl that had seen too many winters, and a pair of boots that had seen even more. And there wasn't anyone waiting who would miss her, so she simply walked away. She left the lean-to, the bloody wash water, and Crowley's shirt sitting in the basin behind her. The cold wind swept through the alley at her back, as if it was doing its best to erase every trace that she'd ever been there at all. Wyatt led her through the quiet streets of Red Hollow. Most of the town had turned in for the night, though the saloon behind them still glowed. Music and voices drifted faintly into the dark. Maggie kept waiting for someone to come after them, for Crowley to burst out the back door hollering, for her mother to step out of a doorway and drag her home by the arm. But nobody came. Nobody so much as looked up. They reached the general store where Wyatt's horse stood tied to the hitching rail. The animal lifted its head as they walked up, blowing a soft breath into the cold. Right away, Maggie could see it was a fine horse, strong-built, well-fed, with a coat that had been looked after. The saddle was worn, but the leather was good quality. This man might dress plainly, but he wasn't careless about the things that mattered. "Can you ride?" Wyatt asked. "Not well. That's all right." He swung up into the saddle with the easy confidence of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, then leaned down and offered his hand again. "I've got you." Maggie hesitated. This was it, her last real chance to turn around. Once she climbed up onto that horse, there was no going back to the life she knew, not even the miserable version of it. Her heart hammered. But when her mind went back to the wash basin, the blood, the cold, she reached up and took his hand. Wyatt pulled her up behind him without effort. "Hold on," he said. Maggie wrapped her arms around his waist. The warmth of his coat and the solid weight of him against her felt strange, but safe. Like something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. Wyatt clicked his tongue, and the horse moved forward. They rode out of Red Hollow beneath a sky packed full of stars. Behind them, the saloon door swung open and the piano got louder for a moment. Then the sound fell back and faded away entirely. Nobody noticed Maggie Dawson leaving town. The road heading north wound through open prairie covered in a thin frost. The horse's hooves struck the frozen ground in a steady, muffled rhythm as they rode. Maggie leaned into Wyatt's back almost before she realized she was doing it. She was exhausted down to the bone. 16-hour days and too many nights sleeping on a hard cabin floor had wrung her dry. The rhythm of the horse nearly rocked her to sleep right there in the saddle. The cold wind bit at her cheeks. But Wyatt's broad shoulders cut the worst of it. She must have drifted off because the next thing she knew, the horse was slowing. "We're here," Wyatt said quietly. Maggie blinked herself awake. Her legs had gone stiff and half numb, and she stumbled when her boots touched the frozen ground. Wyatt caught her elbow without making a thing of it. "Careful." She looked around. The ranch spread out around her in the dark. Shapes of barns, stretches of fencing, and rolling hills pushing out beyond them. It was too dark to make out much, but she could feel the size of the place. It was bigger than anywhere she had ever been. "This way," Wyatt said. He led her toward a small cabin near the edge of the property. Inside, he struck a match and lit a lamp. Warm yellow light filled the room, and Maggie blinked as her eyes adjusted. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. One main room, a stone fireplace, a solid table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and in the corner, a bed covered with thick blankets. But everything was clean, orderly, and peaceful. Wyatt rubbed the back of his neck. "I know it ain't much." Maggie shook her head quickly. "It's perfect." Her voice cracked a little around the edges. For the first time in years, she was looking at something that actually looked like a home. Wyatt watched her for a quiet moment. "You hungry?" he asked. Maggie almost laughed at the question. Hungry had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember, lodged in her stomach from sun up to sundown, sleeping right beside her most nights. But she gave a simple nod instead. "Yes, sir." He pulled out one of the chairs from the table. "I'll make coffee. Got some cornbread left from this morning." Maggie lowered herself into the chair and let the warmth from the fire begin to seep into her frozen bones. She watched Wyatt move around the cabin with the ease of someone who'd been living alone here for a good while. He stoked the fire, set the kettle on the stove, cut thick slices from a cast-iron pan of cornbread. His movements were unhurried and practiced, a man who knew how to take care of himself. Before long, he set a plate in front of her. Cornbread, hot coffee, real food. Maggie stared at it for just a moment longer than she should have. She wanted to eat it all at once, fast and without ceremony, like someone who'd been without long enough that manners had stopped mattering. But she made herself eat slowly, took her time, held on to what was left of her dignity. "Thank you," she murmured between bites. "You're welcome." Wyatt sat down across from her with his own coffee and watched the fire. They ate quietly for a few minutes. Then he cleared his throat. "We should talk about what to expect." Maggie's stomach tightened. Here it is, she thought. The real reason. The real. Her fingers curled around the coffee cup. "I work early," Wyatt said. "Before sunrise most days." She nodded. "Usually out until evening." Another nod. "You'll have the cabin to yourself during the day." "I'm not expecting anything fancy. No complicated meals, no spotless floors." He shrugged. "Decent food when I get back and the place kept in reasonable order. That's all." "That's all." Maggie hesitated. "And the other part?" Wyatt's eyes softened. "I ain't going to force anything, Maggie." She looked up sharply. "What?" "I know you've got no reason to trust me," he said, calm and even, "and I'm not going to demand anything you're not ready to give." He leaned back in his chair slightly. "Until then, I'll sleep on the floor." The words landed on her like something she hadn't been expecting. The floor? "Been sleeping on harder ground for years," he said, with the faintest lift of his shoulder. "A floor's practically a luxury." Maggie glanced over at the bed in the corner. It looked soft and warm and wide enough for two. But Wyatt had already made up his mind. "You take the bed tonight," he added. "Get some rest." She studied his face carefully. "You really mean that?" "I really do." The fire popped softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the cabin walls. Maggie looked down at her hands. Still cracked and swollen, but the bleeding had stopped. Proof enough of what she'd walked away from. "Tomorrow," Wyatt continued, "we'll ride into town and find the preacher. Make this official." He paused. "Unless you've changed your mind." Maggie thought about Crowley, about the wash basin, about all the years she'd spent being told, one way or another, that she was worth nothing. Then she looked around the little cabin again. The fire, the food, the quiet, and the man sitting across from her who hadn't asked for a single thing except honesty. "No," she said firmly. "I ain't changed my mind." Wyatt gave a single nod. "All right then. But," Maggie raised one finger, "I've got conditions." He leaned forward slightly. "Name them." "You ever hit me? I leave." "Fair. You bring other women here, I leave." "That won't happen." She paused before the last one. "And you can't stop me from learning." "Learning?" "I want to read," Maggie said quietly. "And write." Wyatt didn't hesitate even a breath. "Then I'll teach you." The promise settled into the warm air of the cabin, and for the first time in her life, Maggie Dawson felt something that looked a whole lot like hope. Wyatt repeated it once more after she'd said her piece. "I'll teach you." The words were plain and simple, but to Maggie they carried more weight than anything else he'd offered so far. Reading, writing, things she'd watched other people do her whole life while quietly believing they'd never be available to her. Her throat went tight. "You know how?" she asked softly. "Yes, ma'am." "How'd you learn?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Had a good teacher once," he said. Something in the way he said it told Maggie not to push any further. "Not yet." "Well," he said after a beat, pushing back from the table, "we'd better get some rest." He walked to the corner near the fireplace and pulled 2 thick blankets out of a wooden trunk. Maggie watched him spread them out neatly on the floor beside the hearth. "You sure about that?" she asked. "Sure." He nodded toward the bed. "You take it." Maggie shook her head slowly. "Floor's fine," she said quietly. "I've been sleeping on harder ground my whole life. One more night won't hurt me." Wyatt considered that for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted slightly. A small, almost invisible smile. "We'll share then," he said, "like partners do." Maggie felt heat rise to her face. She turned away so he wouldn't see it. They moved around the cabin quietly after that, Wyatt banking the fire while Maggie washed her face and hands at the basin. The cuts on her knuckles stung when the water hit them, but she barely registered it. Wyatt handed her one of his clean shirts. It hung almost to her knees when she pulled it on, carrying a faint smell of leather and wood smoke that was, strangely, a comfort. They lay down on opposite sides of the bed with a careful space left between them. The fire crackled softly. Out in the dark prairie somewhere, an owl called once and went quiet. Maggie closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Too many thoughts crowding in. "Wyatt," she whispered. "Yeah." His voice came right back, like he'd been lying there wide awake too. "Why did you really do this? The marriage?" Silence for a moment. "I mean," Maggie went on quietly, "a man like you could have found someone better. Someone proper. Educated. I don't want proper." His answer came soft, but sure. "I want honest." She rolled slightly onto her side. "Why?" Another pause, longer this time. Then Wyatt spoke again. "Because I'm tired of pretending." Maggie frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said slowly, "I spent a long time trying to fit into places where I didn't belong." His voice carried a weight she didn't have the whole story behind yet. "But I'm done with that." The fire shifted with a soft hiss. Maggie stared into the shadows. "You still don't know me," she said. "I know enough. And if I turn out to be someone you don't like?" Wyatt chuckled quietly. "Then we'll figure it out." "That simple?" "Most things are," he said. Maggie let out a slow breath. "You're strange." "Been told that before." The quiet came back, softer this time. Eventually, Maggie's eyes started getting heavy. For the first time in years, she felt safe enough to let them close. Just before sleep took her, she felt Wyatt's hand brush lightly against hers on the blanket. He didn't grab it, didn't pull. He just left it there, close enough to let her know she wasn't alone. And for the first time in her life, Maggie Dawson fell asleep without fear. Morning came in on the smell of bacon. Maggie surfaced slowly, confused for a moment about where she was. Warm sunlight was coming through the small window of the cabin, laying a golden stripe across the floor. The fire was already going, and Wyatt stood at the stove with his back to her, cooking. "Morning," he said, without turning around. Her voice came out rough with sleep. "Morning." She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The warmth of the cabin felt like something foreign after so many cold mornings, waking up stiff and empty. "What time is it?" she asked. "Nearly 7. You let me sleep that long?" Wyatt glanced back over his shoulder. "You looked like you needed it." He set 2 plates on the table. Bacon, eggs, thick-cut bread. More food in one place than Maggie had seen at one sitting in months. "Eat," he said. She slid into the chair and stared down at the plate. "I can't eat all this." "Try." She tried, but after a few bites, her stomach pushed back. Months of scraps had shrunk it down to half its proper size. Still, even eating half of it felt like a feast. Wyatt finished and stood, pulling on his coat. "I'll saddle the horse." Maggie looked up. "Where are we going?" "To town. Reverend Dalton lives out near Red Hollow. Sunday mornings he's usually home." He paused at the door. "Figure we can catch him before he rides out." Maggie understood. "And then we get married, legal and proper." He reached for the door. "Unless you've changed your mind." Maggie looked down at her hands again. The cuts had closed up overnight, though they still stung. They were proof enough of the life she was walking away from, and a reminder of how easily she could be pulled back into it. "No," she said firmly. "I ain't changed my mind." "Good." He nodded once and stepped outside. Dress warm. It's colder than yesterday." The door clicked shut. Maggie stood slowly and took in the cabin one more time. Her cabin now. Her life. Her husband-to-be. By rights, fear ought to have been sitting heavy in her chest. But what she felt instead was something different. Something fragile and careful. Hope. She changed into her patched brown dress, wrapped her thin shawl tight around her shoulders, braided her hair, and washed her face at the basin until the cold water had her fully awake. When she stepped outside, Wyatt was already waiting beside the horse. He looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You look fine," he said. Maggie felt heat rise to her face. "I look like exactly what I am." "Yeah," Wyatt said softly. "You do?" He helped her up into the saddle. This time she didn't hesitate before wrapping her arms around his waist. The morning air was sharp and clean as they headed back toward Red Hollow. The rising sun spread gold across the frost-covered prairie. They rode mostly without talking. Maggie's stomach wound tighter with every mile. "What happens after?" she asked quietly. "After what?" "The wedding." Wyatt kept his eyes on the road ahead. "After that, we go home." Home. The word settled deep in her chest. It felt strange and new, but it also felt somehow exactly right. They came over the last ridge just as Red Hollow appeared below them. Smoke rose from chimneys. The church bell rang faintly in the distance. Maggie drew a slow breath. She was about to marry a man she barely knew, and yet somehow, standing there on the edge of it all, it still felt like the safest decision she had ever made. Reverend Dalton lived in a small white house at the edge of Red Hollow, right where the town gave way to open prairie. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from his chimney as Wyatt brought the horse to a stop. Maggie's stomach had twisted itself into a tight knot. "You all right?" Wyatt asked quietly. "Fine, you're shaking." I said I'm fine. Said I'm... He didn't push. He just tied up the horse and helped her down, and her legs felt unreliable beneath her. Before they could even knock, the front door opened. A gray-haired man in his 50s stepped out, holding a cup of coffee. His sharp eyes moved from Wyatt to Maggie in a single quick sweep. "Well now," the Reverend said. "Didn't expect company this early." "Morning, Reverend," Wyatt said, tipping his hat. "Need a favor." The older man raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" His gaze came to rest on Maggie. "And who might this young lady be?" "This is Maggie Dawson," Wyatt said. "Soon to be Maggie Mercer, if you're willing to marry us." The Reverend's eyebrows climbed considerably higher. "That's quite a favor. I'll pay double your usual fee. It ain't about the money." Reverend Dalton stepped closer, his eyes moving over Maggie's worn dress and rough hands. "Miss Dawson," he said slowly. "You're Ruth Dawson's daughter, aren't you?" Maggie felt her jaw tighten. "Yes, sir." "And you want to marry this man?" "I do." "Known him long?" She hesitated. "Long enough." The Reverend looked between them. Maggie could see the questions forming behind his eyes. Was this desperation? A bad bargain? Something that ought to be stopped before it got any further? Finally, he let out a sigh. "Well, come inside then." Relief flickered through her chest, but the Reverend raised a finger before she could breathe easy. "I'll need witnesses." Wyatt frowned. "Can't marry you without them," the Reverend said. "I can fetch someone," Wyatt offered. "No need." The Reverend nodded in the direction of the small church next door. "Sunday service starts soon enough. People will be gathering." Maggie's heart nearly stopped dead in her chest. "In front of everyone?" "It's proper," Reverend Dalton said, folding his arms. "Unless you've got something to hide." The challenge sat between them in the cold morning air. Panic started rising in Maggie's chest. Half the town would be in that church. Crowley, her mother. Every person who had ever spoken ill of her would be sitting in those pews. Wyatt turned to her. "Your choice." Her choice. Strange words. Most of Maggie's life had gone by without anyone offering her one. She squared her shoulders. Do it. Wyatt blinked. You sure? If we're doing this, she said firmly, we do it properly. Reverend Dalton gave a single nod. Service starts in an hour. I'll make the announcement. He stepped back inside. Maggie stood in the yard without moving. You don't have to do this, Wyatt said quietly. Yes, I do. We could ride to the next town, find a different preacher, and come back here with everyone whispering that we're living in sin. She shook her head. No. Her voice steadied itself. If we're doing this, let them see. See what? That I ain't ashamed. She looked up at him. Are you? Wyatt's jaw tightened. No, ma'am. Down the road, the church bell started ringing. People began arriving in twos and threes. Maggie took a slow breath. Then she reached out and found Wyatt's hand. Together, they walked toward the church doors, and whatever was waiting for them on the other side. The church went silent the moment Maggie and Wyatt stepped inside. Every head turned at once. Whispers started up immediately. Is that Maggie Dawson? What on earth is she doing here? Who's that with her? The man from Iron Ridge. Maggie kept her eyes straight ahead as they walked down the aisle and took seats in the back pew. Her hands folded tight in her lap, knuckles white. She had spent most of her life trying to stay out of sight. Right now, the whole town was staring at her. Wyatt shifted slightly beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence without him touching her. Solid and steady. The church filled up quickly. Then the doors creaked open again, and Maggie's stomach dropped straight to the floor. Her mother walked in. Ruth Dawson froze the moment she saw her daughter sitting next to Wyatt Mercer. Shock crossed her face, and right behind it came fury. Maggie Ann Dawson. Her voice cut through the church like a blade. Ruth marched straight down the aisle. What in God's name do you think you're doing here? Maggie stood up slowly. Getting married, Ma. Gasps spread across the pews. Married? Ruth shrieked. To who? To me, ma'am, Wyatt said calmly, rising to stand beside Maggie. Wyatt Mercer. Ruth looked him over with open contempt. You can't marry her. Maggie blinked. What? She's already promised to someone else. The church erupted into murmurs. Maggie felt heat flood her face. The hell I am. Watch your language in the Lord's house, Ruth snapped. You told Mr. Bennett he could have me, Maggie said back, her voice rising, for $20 to cover Frank's gambling debt. More gasps. Ruth's face went pale. That's a lie. It is not a lie, Maggie said, fierce and clear. You told me yourself 2 weeks ago, said I was too old and too plain to do any better. I was trying to secure your future. You were trying to sell me. The church doors slammed open. Crowley stormed in, red-faced and breathing hard. He pointed straight at Maggie. There you are. His voice shook the rafters. You've got some nerve showing your face here after walking off your work last night. I quit, Maggie said. You can't quit. You owe me for the shirts you ruined. I don't owe you a thing. Crowley took a step toward her. You think you can just walk away from me? Wyatt stepped directly between them. Back off, he said, quiet as a stone. Crowley sneered. And who in the hell are you? The man telling you to back off. Crowley's hand drifted toward the gun at his hip. The whole church went dead still. You planning to draw iron in a church? Wyatt asked, the same quiet in his voice. Crowley looked around. The watching congregation, Reverend Dalton standing at the altar with his Bible. Slowly, Crowley's hand dropped back to his side. This ain't over, he snarled at Maggie. Yes, it is. Wyatt didn't move an inch. She doesn't work for you anymore. Crowley looked at Wyatt carefully then, really looked at him. And something in what he saw made him take a step backward. Keep her then, he muttered. Damaged goods anyway. He turned and stormed out, and the church door crashed behind him. Maggie's legs nearly buckled beneath her. Wyatt turned calmly toward the congregation. Anyone else got an objection? Silence. Reverend Dalton cleared his throat and opened his Bible. Well, he said, I suppose we should begin. Maggie stepped forward to stand beside Wyatt, her heart hammering, but her chin lifted high. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running from anyone. Reverend Dalton stood at the front of the church with his Bible lying open in his hands. The room was still buzzing softly with whispers, but bit by bit the voices faded as everyone settled in to see what would happen next. Maggie stood at the altar beside Wyatt. Her heart was beating so hard she was fairly certain everyone around her could hear it. The Reverend cleared his throat. "Well," he said carefully, "most marriages come with a good deal more preparation than this one has. But sometimes life moves faster than we plan for." A few quiet chuckles moved through the room. Reverend Dalton turned toward Maggie. "Miss Dawson, do you come here of your own free will?" "I do," she said clearly. "And do you understand the covenant you are entering? To honor and obey your husband?" "Hold on." Wyatt's voice stopped the room. The Reverend blinked. "Excuse me? That ain't the vow we're making." Murmurs rippled through the church. Wyatt stepped slightly closer to Maggie. "She ain't my property," he said, calm and unhurried. "She's my partner." Reverend Dalton frowned. "That's not exactly traditional." "Don't much care about tradition," Wyatt replied. "I care about doing what's right." He turned toward Maggie. "So here's what I promise." His voice carried steadily through the room. "I promise to respect Maggie Dawson. I promise to provide for her, to stand beside her, and to never raise a hand against her." Maggie felt her throat go tight. "I promise to protect her when the world gets hard, and to treat her like she matters." The words settled into the quiet of the church. Reverend Dalton looked at Maggie. "Miss Dawson, do you wish to make the same vow?" Her heart was so full she could barely find the breath to speak. "I promise the same," she said softly. "Respect, loyalty, partnership." She looked at Wyatt. "And I promise to trust you until you give me reason not to." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't romantic exactly, but it was honest. And somehow that felt like more than all the rest. Reverend Dalton closed his Bible slowly. "Then by the authority vested in me," he paused, then added, "I pronounce you husband and wife." He glanced between them and coughed lightly. "Mr. Mercer, you may kiss your bride." Wyatt looked at Maggie. Maggie looked back. Neither of them moved. Reverend Dalton tried once more. Or not. That's fine too. A few people laughed, mostly out of nerves. Wyatt offered Maggie his arm instead. They walked back down the aisle together, past every staring face in town, past the women who had whispered about her for years, past the men who had treated her like she was nothing. Maggie kept her head up the entire way. Outside, the winter sun hit her hard and clean. Cold air filled her lungs. "You all right?" Wyatt asked. "I think so." "You're shaking." "So are you?" she said. He almost smiled. They were halfway to the horse when a voice called out behind them. "Wait!" An older woman came down the church steps quickly, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Mrs. Dawson," she said warmly, then caught herself and smiled. "Mercer now. Every marriage deserves a proper gift." She pressed the bundle into Maggie's arms. Inside were 2 fresh loaves of bread and a small jar of preserves. Tears stung at Maggie's eyes. "Thank you." The woman pressed her hand gently. "You deserve happiness, child. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Then she turned and hurried away before Maggie could find the words to answer. Wyatt helped her back up onto the horse. As they rode out of Red Hollow, Maggie glanced back just once. The church stood still in the winter light. For the first time she could remember, she wasn't leaving town with shame trailing behind her. She was leaving as somebody's wife, as someone who mattered. The ride back to Iron Ridge Ranch was quieter than the one that had brought them to town. The winter sun sat low in the sky, casting pale light across the frozen prairie. Maggie rode behind Wyatt, her arms loosely around his waist. She was married now. The thought still didn't feel quite real. They rode mostly in silence for the better part of half an hour before Wyatt eased the horse to a stop near the top of a ridge. Maggie. She lifted her head. Yeah? I need to tell you something. His tone was different now. Careful, deliberate. Her stomach pulled tight. All right, she said. Wyatt shifted in the saddle so he could look back at her. The ranch, he began slowly. I don't just work there. Maggie frowned. What do you mean? He took a breath. The owner of Iron Ridge, Ezra Mercer. He's dying. Maggie went very still. And? Wyatt's jaw tightened. He's my father. The world seemed to tilt. Your father? My mother worked this ranch 20 years ago, Wyatt said quietly. When she got pregnant, Ezra sent her away with money to keep her quiet. His voice carried something bitter at the bottom of it. She raised me on her own. Maggie stared at him. And you came back here to claim what belongs to you. Yes. They sat there in the cold wind for a moment. So this marriage, Maggie said slowly, has nothing to do with Ezra, Wyatt said quickly. He doesn't even know yet, but if he dies, you inherit the ranch. Yes. Maggie's hands loosened gradually from his coat. You're going to be rich, probably. Her voice had gone flat. And you married me anyway. A laundry girl from behind a saloon. Wyatt turned to face her fully. I married you because you're strong, he said. He held her gaze. And because you deserve better than what that town gave you. Maggie looked away, out across the land below them. Iron Ridge Ranch spread out for miles, rolling hills, fences, outbuildings. The sheer size of it pressed down on her chest. People are going to talk, she said quietly. Let them. They'll say I trapped you. Wyatt shrugged. People always say something. He studied her carefully. Does it matter to you? Maggie didn't answer right away. Her mind was running ahead of her. A big house, hired help, society women who would take one look at her rough hands and cracked open knuckles and already know everything they thought they needed to know. Her mother would come crawling back the moment she caught wind of it, full of sudden apologies. The whole world she'd always known would shift under her feet. It was too much to take in at once. I need to think, she whispered. Wyatt nodded. Take all the time you need. He didn't argue, didn't push, just turned the horse and started moving again toward the ranch. The cabin came into view about an hour later, smoke rising steady from the chimney. Wyatt helped her down from the horse without a word. I should check on the horses, he said. Give you some space. Maggie nodded. Wyatt. He paused. Thank you, she said quietly, for what you did back there, in the church. His expression softened. I meant every word. I know, she hesitated. That's what scares me. Wyatt looked at her for a moment, gave a small nod, and walked toward the barn. Maggie went inside and sat down heavily at the table. Just yesterday morning she had been on her knees behind a saloon, scrubbing blood out of Cowboy's shirts. Now she was the wife of a man who might soon own one of the largest ranches in Wyoming. The thought made her head swim. She put her face in her hands. Her life had turned over completely in the space of a single night, and she had no clear picture yet of what came next. Maggie sat at the cabin table for a long time after Wyatt headed for the barn. The fire crackled. The room was quiet. Her thoughts wouldn't settle. Yesterday she had been behind that saloon, praying Crowley wouldn't come outside drunk again. Now she was the wife of a man who stood to inherit one of the biggest ranches in the territory. It felt like someone else's story, like a thing that had happened to a different woman entirely. The door creaked open and Wyatt stepped back inside, brushing cold air from his coat. He stopped when he saw her sitting there with her head in her hands. You all right? He asked gently. Maggie looked up. I'm working on it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finally, Maggie broke the quiet. Wyatt. He waited. If all this becomes real, if you take over Iron Ridge. She paused. I don't know how to be the wife of a wealthy man. I didn't marry you to turn you into someone else. But people will expect things, she said. Formal dinners, social manners, things I was never taught. Then we'll learn them together. Maggie frowned. You already know that world. Wyatt shook his head. You think I grew up in the big house? He said quietly. I spent my life working cattle and mending fences. She blinked. You did? Ezra never claimed me, he said. Not until recently. Maggie sat with that for a moment. So you don't belong in that world either. Wyatt smiled faintly, not even a little. The understanding settled between them quietly. Two people who had always been on the outside, trying to build something real in a world that wasn't especially interested in giving them the chance. Maggie reached across the table. Her fingers found his rough hand and rested there. I ain't running, she said softly. Even if things get hard, even if people talk, I made a promise. She pressed her hand against his, and I keep mine. Something shifted in Wyatt's face. Relief, and something a good deal deeper. I'm glad, he said, barely above a whisper. They stayed like that while the fire burned lower. Outside, the wide land of Iron Ridge stretched under the winter sky, fences and hills and open prairie, all of it waiting for the next season to come. A place full of hard work and hard weather, but also, maybe, something worth staying for. For the first time in her life, Maggie didn't look at the future as something to dread. It was something she could build, one honest day at a time. She leaned back in the chair and let her eyes move slowly around the little cabin. It wasn't grand. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was warm, and it was hers. Wyatt stood and crossed to the fireplace, setting another log into the flames. They rose brighter, filling the cabin with a soft, steady gold. Maggie watched him for a moment, then smiled quietly to herself. Red Hollow had spent years telling her she was worth nothing. The world had done its level best to break her. But the man standing in that cabin had looked at her and seen something different. And for the first time, she believed him.